Let's move on now to aperture. Within the lens of your camera is a set of overlapping leaves that are able to leave a hole or aperture for light to pass through. Now this set of leaves within the lens can be adjusted to make the hole or aperture larger or smaller. And by being able to vary the size of this hole, it regulates how much light is able to pass through the lens. And as I said before, photography at its most basic is recording light onto the sensor. That's how you make an image. You're recording light. So all of these processes can help you control how much light reaches the sensor to record an image. So aperture at its most basic allows you to adjust how much light actually reaches your image sensor. Think of it like a tap. If you have the tap wide open, which would be a large aperture, a large amount of water comes out. If you close the tap down, a small aperture, a smaller amount of water comes through. It's exactly the same process but with light in the lens of your camera. Aperture is measured in what's called f-numbers or f-stops. Now I'll try and keep this as simple as possible. F-stops or f-numbers tend to go from very small numbers to larger numbers. A typical range would be something like f2.8 going up to f22. Now this is where it can get slightly confusing, and I'll try and make this as simple as possible. The smaller the f number, the larger the aperture opening is. So an aperture of 2.8 is a large aperture which allows a lot of light through. An aperture of f22 is a small aperture which allows less light through. The number actually has very little to do with the actual size of the hole. It's actually referring to the focal length that hole allows the light to achieve. Now this is probably getting a little bit too complicated, so we'll cover this in more detail later on. But just for now, the most simple thing to remember is a small f number, f2.8, is a large hole. A large f number, f22, is a small hole. So let's have a look at a lens of a camera, and we'll show you exactly how the aperture works and how you adjust the size of the hole or aperture within the lens. Okay, to try and explain aperture a little bit better, I'm going to use a lens here. So we have a lens of a camera. This is an older lens which allows me to actually adjust the apertures manually. So let's have a look. We're looking down the lens now from the camera end. Now, as you can see straight through, and at the moment the lens is set on its widest aperture, which is 2.8. And as I was saying earlier, the numbers relate to the focal length, not the size of the aperture. So the smaller the number, the larger the aperture size. So at the moment this lens is set on 2.8. As I start to turn the aperture ring, you'll see the aperture closing down. We go all the way to its smallest aperture, which on this lens is f22. And there we go, that's our smallest aperture. So you can see now that it's a much smaller size hole or aperture. So that's f22, that's f2.8. So f2.8, f22. And as you can see, between each of those stages you have varying sizes of aperture. So on this lens, this is f2.8, that's f4, that's f5.6, that's f8, that's f11, f16, and finally f22. And that's a fairly typical aperture range for a good lens. So f22, as we were saying, is the smallest aperture. f2.8 on this lens is the widest aperture. So a wide aperture like this will give you a shallow depth of field, and a small aperture like this will give you a deep depth of field. So wide aperture, shallow depth of field, small aperture, deep depth of field. So one more time, that's f22 there, that's f2.8, f22, f2.8, and all of the stages and steps in between. So now we've got some understanding of what f numbers are, and we've seen how the aperture works within a proper lens. Why would you need to change your aperture at all? And once again, like with shutter speed, there are two reasons. There's a technical reason and an artistic reason. The technical reason is, by adjusting the size of the aperture hole, you're controlling the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor. With a large aperture hole, a lot of light is allowed to reach the sensor. With a small aperture hole, much less light is reaching the sensor. So, as I said before, photography is about controlling light to create an image. The aperture settings allows you to control how much light passes through the lens to reach the sensor. Now the other side is the artistic reason. And what the aperture allows you to do within your photograph is control what's called the depth of field. Depth of field is something again we'll look at in more detail, but in its most basic form, it's how much of your image is in sharp focus. If you photograph something with what's called a deep depth of field, everything should be in focus. If you photograph something with what's called a shallow depth of field, only your subject should be in focus with the background blurring away. For example, if you're photographing a landscape, you probably want everything from the front of the image all the way through into the distance to be in sharp focus. So how does the aperture adjust the depth of field? Again, it comes down to what size aperture you're using. You probably learnt at school that light travels in straight lines. When the light passes through a large aperture, it's coming through at quite a steep angle, and the point where those lines of light converge is what's called your focal point. And because it's coming through at quite a steep angle, those lines disperse away from each other quite quickly, giving you a small amount that is actually in focus. And this is a shallow depth of field, such as in a portrait where the subject is sharp but the background is blurred. And that's with a wide aperture, because the light's coming through at quite a steep angle, it's meeting at the focal point and then dispersing off quite quickly, giving the blurred effect in the background. If you're using a small aperture, the light is coming through at a much shallower angle, so therefore the points where the lines of light cross stay closer together for longer, meaning that the amount that is staying in focus is much greater, therefore giving you a much greater depth of field. So the two examples of this would be, a shallow depth of field would be for something like a portrait, where you want the subject sharp but the background blurred. A deep depth of field with a small aperture would be for something like landscapes, where you want everything from the foreground to the distance to be in sharp focus. Again, we'll look at depth of field in more detail later on, so that's a very basic rundown of how aperture is used to affect the depth of field in your photography. So let's have a quick recap. The two things we looked at are shutter speed and aperture, both of which are used to control light reaching your image sensor. Your shutter speed dictates how much time light reaches the sensor for, and therefore how much time is recorded in your image. Quick shutter speed, very small amount of time. Slower shutter speed, much longer amount of time. The aperture controls how much light reaches the sensor, and also the angle at which that light is focused. Again, I know this can be confusing. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and we'll try and answer them next time round.